Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video of the Global Awareness Report. As always, we are just going to get straight into it. In the Bakhmut sector, Russian forces have captured much of the northwestern part of the city and have pushed past the rail line running straight through the city here, and have continuing to push west, trying to capture all of the city. According to some sources, they have actually managed to capture up to 80% of the city, and I think that's about correct just looking at the map here. And Ukrainian forces are still holding on. They are still fighting the Wagner private military company that is the main participants in the Battle of Bakhmut. And the reason why I believe the Ukrainians are still holding on and are still trying to fight for the city, even though there might not seem like there's any kind of point to hold on, is I think there are two reasons, at least two primary reasons. One, Russia is probably taking a lot of casualties trying to capture the city. Urban warfare is very costly for the attacker in most scenarios, and it is easier to defend in an urban environment than to attack in an urban environment. And secondly, I think Ukraine is trying to hold on to Bakhmut in order to try to slow down the Russians as much as possible in order to prepare for some kind of offensive. They want to stall the Russians as much as possible from taking the city so that they can prepare their own offensives and try to counterattack and maybe try to retake Bakhmut and retake a lot of this territory that they've lost over the past year that the war has been raging. And that's going to be pretty much it, as the Battle of Bakhmut is the main focus of the war. There has not been a lot of any kind of significant news on any other parts of the front. There is still combat in Avdiivka, and there is combat near Toretsk, around this area, but other than that, there's not a whole lot of major frontline changes. There's battles around Bilohorivka, but not just very minor frontline changes. The only major frontline changes have been in Bakhmut. So we are now going to move on to the geopolitical side of things. And last episode, I was very skeptical of these leaked Pentagon documents, but I believe now that they have basically been confirmed to be real, as major mainstream news sources are reporting on them, acting as they are real, and as we will talk about later in this episode, the man who is responsible for leaking the documents has been arrested and has been accused of espionage and this stuff, and that the United States government is actually trying to get him in prison, and he has to go through trial now. He's going to have to go through trial. So the fact that they've arrested a suspect who leaked these documents kind of proves that they are real. And within these documents, it showed that there are Western NATO special forces operating within Ukraine. This is a BBC article. The UK is among a number of countries with military special forces operating inside Ukraine, according to one of the dozens of documents leaked online. It confirms what has been subject of quiet speculation for over a year. The leaked files, some marked top secret, paint a detailed picture of the war in Ukraine, including sensitive details of Ukraine's preparations for a spring counteroffensive. The U.S. government says it's investigating the source of the leak. According to the document, dated 23rd of March, the UK has the largest contingent of special forces in Ukraine, with 50 special forces personnel, followed by Latvia, France, the United States, and the Netherlands. Latvia has 17, France has 15, the United States has 14, and the Netherlands has 1 special forces personnel operating inside of Ukraine. The document does not say where the forces are located or what they are doing. The numbers of personnel may be small, but and will doubtlessly fluctuate. But special forces are by their very nature highly effective. Their presence in Ukraine is likely to be seized upon by Moscow, which has in recent months argued that it is not just confronting Ukraine but NATO as well. So this sort of Russian narrative of that they're not just fighting Ukraine, that they're fighting all of NATO, actually does have some merit to it, because these leaks have, as I've said, they've basically been proven to be true at this point. So there are NATO special forces within Ukraine fighting against the Russians and doing whatever that they're doing. Obviously, it's special forces. It's going to be highly secretive, and it's unlikely that those documents would be leaked. But so the Russian claims that there were Western special forces operating in Ukraine have actually been turned out to be true. And Russia is not actually just fighting NATO. They are, of course, mostly fighting Ukraine. It's like probably 90%, 99% Ukraine. I mean, if you want to count personnel only, but if you want to count all the weapons that the West has sent to Ukraine, then it's not entirely wrong to say Russia is fighting NATO as well as Ukraine. In some sense, that's not entirely wrong. We are going to move over to Poland, where Poland has prohibited food imports from Ukraine to soothe farmers, the complaints of Polish farmers. Poland's government said on Saturday that it has decided to temporarily prohibit grain and other food imports from Ukraine as it seeks to soothe the rising anger of Polish farmers who say that they are losing a huge amount of money to a glut of Ukrainian grain on the market. So Poland has, of course, been probably the most pro-Ukraine country in the world, but even they are kind of even they put their own national interests first above that of Ukraine, which, in my opinion, that's what pretty much every country in the world does. They always put their national interests and their people's interests first. And that's what a lot of countries tend to do. It's not, of course, always the case, but this is what Poland has decided to do, is they have started to block Ukrainian grain exports, which is probably very bad for Ukraine, as Ukraine probably gets a lot of money from those grain exports. So the leader of the protesting farmers and head of the Agraro Unita group estimates farmers lose up to $2.3 billion, or 10 billion zlotys. Polish is a very difficult language to pronounce, as I'm sure many of you know. It's probably as difficult as Ukrainian. But anyways, the rising anger of farmers comes ahead of an election in the fall and is a headache for the ruling Conservative Law and Justice Party as it seeks a third term. So that's also a reason why, is of course they want to win the election, so they're doing this in hopes that it will boost their popularity in the polls. We are going to move on to some news out of Belarus and Russia now, where Russian pilots have been training Belarusian pilots in nuclear weapon use. The Belarusian Air Force crews have completed their training for using tactical nuclear weapons as part of Russia's plan to deploy the weapons to its ally Belarus amid the fighting in neighboring Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense said on Friday. The ministry released a video in which a Belarusian pilot said that the training course in Russia had given the crews of the Belarusian Air Force Su-25 ground attack jets the necessary skills for using the weapons. As we have reported on previously, Russia has been deploying nuclear weapons into Belarus, and now they are training Belarusian pilots on on the uses of those nuclear weapons. So in a way, it's almost as if they're kind of gifting Belarus the nuclear weapons, but obviously Belarus does not have the authority to use them. But if Russia wanted Belarus, if Russia wanted Belarusian pilots to use tactical nuclear weapons, they are now capable of them. At least the ones that were trained are now capable of them. Belarus is, of course, a very staunch Russian ally. And this appears to be just further integration. There's this concept, this idea called the Union State, in which it's basically the people who advocate for the Union State are those who advocate for Belarus and Russia to join together and become one country. And it appears that that idea is gaining a lot of, I guess it's becoming more and more realized as Russia and Belarus become further integrated. So maybe in the future, something like the Union State where Russia and Belarus become one country, that might not be entirely out of the question given how integrated these countries are, although I suspect that it's not very likely. But it is certainly a possibility, and it's looking like it's becoming more and more of a possibility as time goes on, and as the West becomes increasingly anti-Belarus and anti-Russian, and as Belarus and Russia become increasingly anti-Western, that something like that might happen. But we are going to move over to news from Russia, where Russian e-conscription overhauls is underlining a scramble for military manpower from this Reuters article. A rapid overhaul to Russia's conscription system rushed through Parliament on Wednesday has underlined a scramble for additional manpower for its forces fighting Ukraine. On Wednesday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the extremely important law was intended to solve what he called a mess in Russia's draft centers that had been exposed by a partial mobilization in September when the government was forced to retract a number of wrongly issued draft papers. So Russia is trying to modernize its conscription laws, and they even had to retract wrongly issued draft papers. I actually did not know that. So obviously Russia needs as much manpower as it can get in Ukraine, and this is pretty unsurprising that they would try to have the most up-to-date conscription system possible using, using like the internet and smartphones. I believe one of the things about the law had something to do with sending notifications out via smartphone, via text. I think that was something like that. But anyways, we are going to move on here, try to get this video to not be super long. Finland starts a border fence with its border with Russia amid migration and security concerns. Finland is building the first stretch of a fence on its border with Russia on Friday, less than 2 weeks after it joined NATO, to complete a complete security U-turn in response to the war in Ukraine. Fearing retaliation from the east following its NATO application, the government decided last year to construct a barrier primarily in case Russia moved to flood the border with migrants. Finland aims to guard against a repeat of events on the European Union's eastern frontier in Poland in winter 2021, when the bloc accused neighboring Belarus, of a staunch Russian ally, of engineering a crisis by flying in migrants from the Middle East, giving them visas, and pushing them across the border. I remember reading about that, where Belarus was taking in migrants and then sending them to the Polish border. And I believe they also did the same thing with Lithuania. They sent them to the Lithuanian and Polish borders to try and stir up trouble and to sort of show that Belarus can has the capability of messing with NATO. But now Finland is in NATO. Now they're going to build a border fence. Made of steel mesh, the Finnish fence is scheduled to cover some 200 kilometers of the most crucial parts of its border by the end of 2026. Project manager Ismo Kiriki said on Friday that while it is not intended to stop any invasion attempt, the fence will have surveillance equipment. Obviously, Finland is now in NATO, and they are very hostile towards Russia, of course. So, and they've historically not been on great terms with Russia. In the 30s, of course, with the Winter War and whatnot, but after that, during the Cold War, they didn't have the worst relations with the Soviet Union. But now that they are in NATO and after the war in Ukraine has started, obviously relations have taken a massive downward spiral, and now they are building border fences along the border with Russia. Now we're going to move on to Paris, where a bill intending to raise the pension age, an age in which someone can receive pensions, from 62 to 64 has caused mass rioting in France. French President Emmanuel Macron's flagship pension reform bill will enter into force swiftly, officials said on Friday, after it received the Constitutional Council's approval. So, this very controversial bill that has led to a lot of rioting, a lot of protests, appears to soon be French law. The legislation, which pushes the age in which someone can draw a pension to 64 from 62, remains deeply unpopular, and spontaneous protests broke out when the Constitutional Council's decision was announced. So France has been rife with instability for a long time. If you remember the Yellow Vest protests, and now we have this retirement age bill. Emmanuel Macron, it's interesting because I'm not sure if he himself is deeply unpopular, but it seems that a lot of the things he tries to push through are deeply unpopular, yet they get pushed through anyways. And he won the election. Whenever that was. I forget exactly when the last French election was held, but it wasn't that long ago. And he won that election, so he doesn't seem to be very unpopular, yet a lot of the things he do seem to be unpopular. It's strange. It seems like a very complex political situation in France, and a very unstable political situation in France. And France is, of course, one of the most important members of the European Union. But we are now going to move on to the Middle East and Africa. There's some news over here where Saudi officials have visited the capital of Yemen for peace talks with the Houthi rebels. Saudi officials were in Yemen's capital Sunday, April 9th, for talks with the Iran-backed Houthi rebels as part of international efforts to find a settlement to Yemen's 9-year conflict, officials says. Saudi Arabia's delegation, chaired by the kingdom's ambassador to Yemen, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Jabir, met with Maid al Mashat, head of Houthi Supreme Political Council, which runs rebel-held areas in Yemen, according to the Houthi-run SABA news agency. So, this is very good news for the people of Yemen, as hopefully peace can finally be brought to Yemen. And if you take a look at the map here, this is a rough area where the Houthi rebels control. I'm not sure how entirely accurate this is. I got these borders from Live UA map, so but the Houthi rebels, which are backed by Iran, are in control of the western part of the country, and the western part of the country is where the population lies. The eastern part is very underpopulated. It's mostly just desert. It's very thinly populated. So the part where the official government controls and where like the pro Western government, the pro Saudi government controls are very underpopulated. The Houthis even control the official capital of Yemen, and they control much of the population centers. So they are the faction that has probably the most power in Yemen. But hopefully some kind of peace can come and some kind of compromise, and Yemen can get back on its feet and rebuild after its nearly decade-long civil war. Into Sudan, right across the Red Sea, into Sudan right here, a Sudanese paramilitary group claims control in the presidential palace as deadly fighting flares. At least 3 people have been killed after long-standing tensions between the Sudanese army and a paramilitary group erupted into open fighting. Witnesses reported clashes around the presidential palace and the army headquarters. The paramilitary Rapid Support Force says that they were in control of the presidential palace as well as several airports. The group said that they were responding to a surprise attack from the army on one of its bases. So Sudan is actually quite an important country because of their access to the Red Sea, and they are a pretty staunch Chinese ally. Much of the Sudanese military gets its equipment from China, and I believe Russia was actually interested in building a port or leasing some port along the Red Sea. I believe it was Russia. It may have been Turkey or China, but I'm fairly certain it was Russia actually was interested in building some kind of facility along Sudan's strip of the Red Sea. So Sudan is not a very stable country, but there has been calls for an immediate ceasefire, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for an immediate end to the violence. And we are going to move over to Ethiopia, where there's gunfire and protests in Ethiopia as Ethiopia's Amhara over plan to disband regional forces. So in Ethiopia, there are a lot of it's a very diverse country. There are a lot of ethnic groups in Ethiopia, and one of the things about Ethiopia is that each ethnic group kind of has their own military force in a way. So gunfire was heard in the last 2 towns in Ethiopia's Amhara region on Sunday as thousands protest against the federal government order to integrate regional special forces into police or national army. So there's a lot of they were protesting over that. As Ethiopia is as the Tigray Defense Force actually came in conflict with the federal government, and there was a civil war for a while in Ethiopia, but that civil war has calmed down, and the Tigray Defense Forces have, come into contact with the federal government, and they shook hands, and it appears that they are trying to build peace between the rebel groups and the government in Addis Ababa. But another region in Ethiopia is protesting over the fact that they were trying to integrate the regional forces. Obviously, Ethiopia wants to do that in order to secure stability in the nation and not have something like the Tigray civil war happen again. We are going to move over to East Asia, where we're going to try to get through this quickly. Vietnam has pledged to boost ties with the United States as Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, has visited Hanoi. Vietnam despite the Communist Party being in control of it, is not very, it doesn't have a very socialist economy, and they are very anti-China, as China invaded the country in 1973, and the invasion failed. But Vietnam has been very anti-China, not necessarily super pro-US, but in case of a war between the United States and China, Vietnam would almost certainly side with the United States. And something like an official alliance might not be that far off between Vietnam and the United States in the near future. And as well as in the Philippines, a historic ally of the United States, which has in recent years grew closer to China, although now is coming back to the United States, has initiated with the United States the largest war drills near disputed waters. American and Filipino forces on Tuesday launched their largest combat exercises in decades in the Philippines across the disputed South China Sea. This comes as China also is initiating military drills against Taiwan. Over the past week, they've initiated very large military drills against Taiwan. Recent Chinese air and sea drills simulate an encirclement of Taiwan were intended as a serious warning to the pro-independence politicians on the self-governing island and their foreign supporters, China said on Wednesday, as signs emerge that Beijing will take further action. The 3 days of joint-scale air and sea exercises named Joint Sword that ended on Monday were a response to the Taiwanese president meeting with the U.S. House Speaker in California. So as I've just been saying, pretty much every episode, the tensions between China and the United States and China and Taiwan keep increasing, and the relations between China and Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the United States, the Philippines, Vietnam, it just keeps deteriorating as East Asia is becoming more and more of a geopolitical hotbed. It seems every single week it just becomes that much more intense, the region. So last bit of news, obviously a airman suspected of leaking the secret Pentagon documents was hit with federal charges. 21-year-old member of the U.S. Air National Guard accused of leaking top secret military intelligence records online was charged on Friday with unlawful copying and transmission of classified material. The fact that this happened proves that those documents are real, because if the documents were fake, they wouldn't be arresting anybody. So the United States has indirectly admitted that these documents are real. So that is, of course, we went over it at the beginning of the episode, where there are indeed Western special forces in Ukraine, as those leaked documents suggested. So these documents are real, and that is a very big that's quite a blow to U.S. prestige that their documents got leaked. But it's good for people who study the Ukraine war, and it's going to be good for historians writing about this war in the future, as they'll have access to these documents. But that is going to do it for this episode of the Global Awareness Report. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.